Ever get the feeling that, the internet's like an iceberg, and we're only seeing the tip?
Yeah.
Today we're going deep beneath the surface to explore the dark web.
Ooh, spooky.
Yeah. You know that place with like the reputation for all the hackers, illegal activities, all that scary stuff?
Yeah.
But is that like the whole story?
It's definitely a lot more complex than just the headlines.
Okay.
You can think of it this way. The dark web is a tool.
Okay.
And like any tool, it can be used for good or for bad.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good point. And I know you've been looking into a lecture by Dr. Daniel Owita, aka the Cyber Coach, on this very topic.
Yeah.
He also calls himself the Professor, which I gotta say adds a nice touch of intrigue.
He does. He's a very interesting guy. He's got definitely a flair for the dramatic, but beyond that, he really breaks down the dark web in a way that is both accessible
Right.
and really thought-provoking. So in his recent lecture, he starts off by comparing the internet to an onion
Okay.
with layers upon layers.
Okay. I like where this is going. Let's unpack that analogy.
Yeah.
I think most of us are pretty familiar with what's called the surface web, right?
Yeah.
That's a part that we use every day,
Right.
for news, social media, online shopping, all that.
Exactly. But as the professor points out, the surface web only represents a tiny, tiny fraction of the entire internet, like 4%.
4%? Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then he introduces the concept of what's called the deep web.
Okay.
And this is where things start to get interesting.
Okay. So is this where we find all the hackers in their hoodies, prodding their next move?
Not quite. The deep web isn't inherently bad.
Okay.
It's more about privacy and kind of restricted access.
Okay.
So you can think of things like medical records that are stored in hospital databases,
Mm-hmm.
company intranets,
Yeah.
or academic research that's behind a paywall. So you need specific credentials to get in.
Yeah.
And there's good reason for that.
So it's kind of like having a VIP pass to like these exclusive areas of the internet.
Exactly, exactly. And then this is where the dark web comes in.
Okay.
So it is a small, intentionally hidden part of the deep web. It's designed for anonymity.
Okay.
And you need special tools like Tor,
Okay.
the onion router, to access it.
Okay. And that's where that reputation for like the illegal activities kind of comes in, right?
Yeah.
Like, drug marketplaces, stolen data. Yeah.
Mhm.
All that stuff.
So that's definitely part of the picture. But the professor challenges us to look beyond those sensationalist headlines.
Okay.
He argues that the dark web can also be a vital tool for journalists, activists in countries that have strict censorship laws.
Oh, okay. So they can communicate securely and share information without fear of reprisal.
Exactly.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
It's kind of like a digital shield for those whose voices might otherwise be silenced.
Precisely. But, as you mentioned, there's also a darker side to the dark web.
Right.
And the professor doesn't shy away from that.
Okay.
He talks about the proliferation of these illegal marketplaces.
Yeah.
Where you can find everything from drugs and weapons to stolen credit card numbers.
Oh, wow.
Even hacking services for hire.
It's a little unsettling to think about, honestly.
Yeah.
It's like this hidden world operating just beneath the surface of the internet that we use every day.
Yeah, it definitely raises some complex questions
Yeah.
about privacy, security, the balance of power in the digital age.
Yeah, for sure. But okay, how does Tor, this onion router, as they call it, actually work?
Right.
I know it's supposed to make you anonymous, but I'm not sure I fully grasp the mechanics of it.
So the professor explains it quite elegantly in his lecture.
Okay.
Imagine sending a message through a series of intermediaries, each one adding a layer of encryption, like wrapping it in multiple envelopes.
Okay.
By the time that message reaches its destination, it's practically impossible to trace it back to the original sender.
So it's not just hiding your identity,
Right.
but it's also obscuring your location and the path your data takes
Exactly.
as it travels across the internet.
Exactly. And that's why Tor has become such a valuable tool for journalists, activists, whistleblowers.
Right.
But also, unfortunately, for criminals who want to operate under the radar.
So it sounds like anonymity is kind of like a double-edged sword.
Yeah.
It can be used to protect the vulnerable and empower the voiceless, but it can also be exploited for nefarious purposes.
Absolutely. It's it's the inherent paradox of the dark web.
Right.
And one of the things that makes it so fascinating and frankly a bit unnerving,
Yeah.
it challenges our traditional notions of security and control.
Right.
Now, the professor even delves into the history of Tor,
Which it was actually originally developed by the U.S. Naval Research Laboratory.
Really? I had no idea it had like government origin.
Yeah. So the initial goal was to create a way for intelligence agencies to communicate securely and anonymously.
Oh, wow.
But then the technology was eventually released to the public,
Okay.
and it evolved into this incredibly complex and powerful tool for anyone who wants to navigate the internet without leaving a trace.
It makes you wonder about the unintended consequences of technological innovation.
Right.
You create something for one purpose,
Right.
and it ends up being used in ways you never could have imagined.
Right. It's a recurring theme in the history of technology.
Yeah.
And it highlights the importance of understanding the potential impact of our creations, both positive and negative.
Yeah.
But getting back to the professor,
Yeah.
he also touches upon another tool called I2P,
Okay.
the Invisible Internet Project.
And how is that different from Tor? So while Tor focuses on providing access to websites and services on the dark web,
Yeah.
I2P is more about creating these private networks,
Okay.
almost like a separate hidden internet within the internet.
Whoa. Okay.
So it's often used for things like peer-to-peer file sharing
Yeah.
and private messaging.
So it's less about anonymity and more about creating like a closed community, if
Yeah.
I'm understanding correctly.
That's a good way to put it. And it just illustrates the diversity of uses for dark web technologies, right?
Yeah.
It's not just about accessing, illegal content or
Right.
hiding from the authorities.
Right.
It's also about creating alternative spaces for communication and collaboration,
Yeah.
free from the constraints of the surface web.
That's a really interesting point. It makes me think about like online communities that might be, marginalized or censored on the surface web, kind of finding a safe haven on the dark web.
Exactly. And the professor really emphasizes that it's this diversity of uses that makes the dark web such a complex and challenging phenomenon to kind of grapple with.
Yeah.
It's not a monolithic entity.
Right.
It's a multifaceted ecosystem with its own rules, its own norms, its own subcultures.
So are you saying that anyone could potentially find something of value on the dark web? It's not just like hackers and criminals.
Absolutely. There are forums for discussing sensitive topics, marketplaces for rare goods and services, even platforms for whistleblowing and investigative journalism.
That's a lot to wrap my head around.
It is.
It's like realizing that there's this whole other world out there hidden
Yeah.
in plain sight. I'm starting to see why this is called the deep dive.
Right.
It really is a deep dive into a part of the internet most people never even think about.
Yeah. And the professor's an excellent guide for this journey. He doesn't just present the facts.
Right.
He encourages critical thinking, challenges assumptions, helps us to see the dark web not as like this boogeyman,
Right.
but as a complex phenomenon with both risks and opportunities.
Okay. So we've got a good understanding now of like the layers of the internet, from the surface web to the deep web to the dark web. We've talked about the tools for accessing the dark web, like
Right.
Tor and I2P. And we've touched upon some of the legitimate and illicit uses of this hidden space.
Yeah. We've laid the groundwork, I think, for a deeper exploration of the dark web, its impact on our lives, and the ethical and legal challenges that it presents.
Right. And we haven't even like touched on the potential of the dark web to like undermine nation states or its role in the rise of cryptocurrencies.
Exactly.
That's a good point. We've only just scratched the surface here.
Yeah.
There's so much more to uncover.
Lots more to uncover. Yeah, and while those topics are definitely fascinating, the professor in his lecture chooses to focus on something maybe a little bit more relevant to our everyday lives.
Right.
The impact of the dark web on cybersecurity.
Yeah, that's something I've been thinking about. We often hear about like these massive data breaches.
Right.
And I always wonder, like, does the dark web play a role in those incidents?
It absolutely does. The dark web has become this thriving marketplace for stolen data.
Okay.
Hackers can buy and sell everything from login credentials, credit card numbers, to social security numbers, even medical records.
So if I understand correctly, even if like I never, venture onto the dark web myself.
Right.
My personal information could still end up there
Right.
if a company that I do business with gets hacked.
That's exactly the point that the professor's making.
Okay.
He emphasizes that the dark web isn't some like isolated, disconnected realm. It's interconnected with the surface web in ways that most people don't realize.
It's like this invisible undercurrent kind of like influencing the digital world that we interact with every day.
Exactly. And that's why the professor stresses the importance of cybersecurity awareness,
Right.
even for those who think they have nothing to hide.
Okay, so what are some practical steps that we can take to kind of protect ourselves in this interconnected, digital landscape?
So the professor offers some really, really solid advice in his lecture.
Okay.
He starts with the basics, like using strong, unique passwords for every online account.
That's something that we hear all the time, but it's amazing how many people still just use the same weak password for everything.
Right. It's like using the same key to unlock your house, your car, and your safe deposit box, right?
Right. Yeah.
It just doesn't make sense from the security standpoint.
Yeah.
He also highly recommends using a password manager,
Okay.
which can generate and store those complex passwords for you, so you don't have to remember them all.
That's a good tip. I've been meaning to try out a password manager. There's so many to choose from, though.
Right.
Do you have any recommendations?
So the professor mentions a few popular options like 1Password and LastPass.
Okay.
They all have kind of slightly different features, so it's worth doing a little bit of research to find one that fits your needs.
Okay, noted. What else does the professor suggest?
He also stresses the importance of enabling two-factor authentication whenever possible. It adds an extra layer of security by requiring a second form of verification, like a code sent to your phone or email in addition to your password.
I've seen that option on some websites, but I'll admit I usually just skip it because it seems like kind of a hassle.
I get it. It can feel like an extra step.
Yeah.
But it's a really, really effective way to deter those hackers.
Right.
Think of it this way. Even if someone manages to steal your password, they still won't be able to access your account without that second form of verification.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm starting to see that a little extra effort can go a long way in terms of online security.
Absolutely. And it's not just about protecting yourself, right?
Right.
It's also about protecting your data and the data of others.
Okay.
Every time we make our online accounts more secure, we're making the internet as a whole a little bit safer.
That's a good perspective.
Yeah.
It's easy to feel overwhelmed by the scale of the problem, but like you said, every little bit helps.
Exactly. And the professor reminds us that cybersecurity isn't just about technology,
Right.
It's also about awareness and behavior.
Okay.
He talks about the importance of being cautious about what we click on, what information we share online,
Right.
who we trust in the digital world.
It's like developing a healthy sense of skepticism.
Right?
Right. Like not assuming that everything you see online is legitimate or trustworthy.
Precisely. The professor even brings up the concept of what's called social engineering, which is a tactic used by hackers to manipulate people into revealing sensitive information or taking actions that compromise their security.
Like those phishing emails that try to trick you into clicking on a malicious link or giving up your password.
Exactly. They often prey on our emotions, our curiosity, our desire to help.
Right.
They might impersonate a legitimate organization or even someone to make their requests seem more convincing.
So it's not just about having strong passwords
Right.
and the right security software,
Yeah.
but it's also about being savvy, being discerning online.
Right. It's about being aware of the potential risks and taking steps to mitigate them.
So in a way, cybersecurity is kind of like a game, isn't it? The hackers are constantly trying to find new ways to exploit vulnerabilities.
Right.
And we have to kind of stay one step ahead by, understanding their tactics and adapting our defenses.
It's a constant back and forth. But, the good news is we don't have to be cybersecurity experts to protect ourselves. Simple things like using strong passwords and enabling two-factor authentication, being cautious about what we click on can make a huge difference.
That's reassuring to hear. It feels like the professor is really trying to empower, his students and us by extension to kind of take control of our online security.
That's definitely his goal. He wants to demystify cybersecurity
Yeah.
and make it accessible to everyone.
I think he's doing a great job of that. His lecture's packed with practical advice and insights.
He also doesn't shy away from the complexity of the issue, right?
Okay.
He acknowledges that there are no easy solutions
Right.
and that cybersecurity is an ongoing process, not a one-time fix.
That's an important point, yes. It's not about, like, achieving perfect security, which is probably impossible.
Right.
But it's more about managing risk and making informed choices.
Exactly. And he reminds us that the internet is constantly evolving.
Right.
So we need to stay informed and adapt our security practices as new threats emerge.
So we need to be lifelong learners.
Yes.
When it comes to cybersecurity.
That's the key takeaway.
Ah.
We can't just set it and forget it.
Right.
We need to stay engaged
Yeah.
and be proactive about protecting ourselves and our data.
Okay, so we've talked about the risks associated with the dark web and some practical steps we can take to mitigate those risks.
Right.
But I'm curious, does the professor address the ethical considerations of the dark web?
He certainly does.
Okay.
He acknowledges that the anonymity provided by the dark web
Right.
can be, a double-edged sword, right?
Yeah.
It can be used to protect whistleblowers and activists.
Right.
But it can also be used to shield criminals and
Right.
those who engage in, really harmful activities.
Yeah, it's that tension we keep coming back to. Anonymity can be both a force for good and a shield for, bad actors.
Right. And the professor doesn't offer any easy answers.
Right.
He presents the different perspectives on the issue
Yeah.
and encourages his students to think critically about the implications of the dark web
Right.
for society as a whole.
So it's not just about the technical aspects of the dark web, but
Right.
also the broader social
Mhm.
and ethical considerations.
Exactly. And that's what makes the professor's lecture so valuable.
Yeah.
He goes beyond kind of that surface level
Yeah.
and helps us grapple with those complexities of the dark web
Yeah.
in a nuanced and thought-provoking way.
It's definitely given me a lot to think about.
Me too. And I think it's important to remember that, the professor is just one voice in a much larger conversation about the dark web. There are many different perspectives on this topic, and it's worth, exploring those different viewpoints to form our own opinions.
That's a good point. It's easy to kind of get caught up in one particular narrative,
Right.
but it's important to kind of stay open to, other interpretations, other perspectives.
Exactly. And I think that's the beauty of, a deep dive like this.
Yeah.
It's not about arriving at definitive answers,
Right.
but it's about opening up new lines of inquiry and expanding our understanding of this complex
Yeah.
and ever-evolving phenomenon.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in this discussion about the dark web.
We
We've
have.
explored its history, its technical underpinnings, its uses, both good and bad, and the ethical challenges it presents.
And we've also touched upon the importance of cybersecurity awareness
Right.
and some practical steps we can take to protect ourselves in this digital age.
Right, but I have a feeling there's still more to uncover. This feels like just the beginning of our exploration.
Yeah.
It feels like we've only just dipped our toes in the deep end of the pool here.
That's a great analogy. The dark web is this vast and murky and constantly shifting landscape.
Right.
It's easy to get lost in the details, but I think the professor provides a really, really valuable framework
Yeah.
for understanding the big picture.
And one of the things that really struck me from his lecture is this idea that the dark web is like a reflection of ourselves,
Yeah.
both the good and the bad.
He actually uses the term digital shadow self,
Okay.
which I found quite evocative.
Yeah.
It suggests that the dark web isn't some separate entity out there. It's an extension of human nature with all its complexities and contradictions.
So are you saying that the dark web is essentially a mirror, like reflecting back our own desires, our fears, our motivations?
In a way, yes. It provides a space for anonymity and freedom from those societal constraints, which can be both liberating and dangerous, depending on how it's used.
It makes me think of those classic superhero stories
Yeah.
where, the hero and the villain are often like two sides of the same coin.
Right.
They both have these extraordinary abilities, but they choose to use those abilities in
Right.
very, very different ways.
That's a great comparison. And the professor even touches upon this idea in his lecture.
Okay.
He talks about how the same tools and technologies that can be used to, fight for social justice
Right.
can also be used to exploit and harm others.
But it all comes down to like intent, right? Like the choices that we make.
Exactly. And that's why the professor emphasizes the importance of ethical consideration
Right.
in the digital realm.
Yeah.
He argues that we need to develop like a strong moral compass
Right.
to guide our actions online, just as we do in the physical world.
Isn't that like easier said than done? The internet often feels like, kind of a Wild West where the rules are constantly changing. And the lines between like, right and wrong can be so blurred.
That's true. And the professor acknowledges that the dark web presents some unique ethical challenges.
Yeah.
He talks about the difficulty of enforcing laws
Right.
in a space that's designed for anonymity.
Right.
And that tension between freedom of expression
Yeah.
and the need to protect individuals from harm.
Yeah, it's a balancing act, isn't it?
It is.
Trying to preserve the positive aspects of the dark web while also like mitigating the risks
Right.
and preventing its misuse.
Exactly. And there are no easy answers.
Right.
The professor encourages his students to engage in these, open and honest conversations about these challenges.
Okay.
To consider different perspectives and to work towards, solutions that prioritize both security and freedom.
So it's not about like, shutting down the dark web or demonizing its users.
Right.
It's about like finding ways to kind of navigate this complex space responsibly and ethically.
That's the key message. We can't simply ignore the dark web or pretend that it doesn't exist.
Right.
It's part of our digital reality,
Yeah.
and we need to learn how to live with it
Yeah.
in a way that that benefits society as a whole.
It's a tall order, but I think the professor provides a really valuable starting point.
He does.
He gives us the tools and the knowledge to approach the dark web with like a sense of, informed curiosity and a critical eye.
And he reminds us that the choices we make online have real-world consequences.
Yeah.
Our actions, both large and small, shape the digital landscape and influence the kind of internet we create for ourselves and for future generations.
That's a powerful thought. It makes me want to be like more mindful of my own online behavior.
Right.
And to use my, my digital presence for good.
That's the kind of impact the professor hopes to have. He wants to empower individuals to become those responsible digital citizens.
Right.
And to contribute to a more ethical and secure online world.
Well, I think we've done a pretty thorough deep dive into the dark web today.
I think so.
Thanks in no small part to the professor's insights. We've explored its history, its technical underpinnings, its uses, its risks, and the ethical considerations it raises.
Right.
And we've come away, I think, with a better understanding of how the dark web is shaping the internet and how we can navigate this complex space safely and responsibly.
Absolutely.
So to wrap things up, I think the key takeaway here is this. The dark web isn't going away.
Right.
It's here to stay.
It is.
And the more we understand about it, the better equipped we'll be to make those, informed choices about our online lives.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Knowledge is power, as they say. And in the digital age, that knowledge is more important than ever.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the dark web. We'll be back next time with another fascinating topic to explore. Until then, stay curious, stay informed, and stay safe out there.